This is weird, sitting in front of my computer, making a speech to an imaginary audience. In the old days, they used to say, if you're nervous, imagine your audience naked. That's something I never really understood, why that would make you not nervous. But what I did do was I found someone in the audience, maybe one or two people, who seemed to be interested in what I had to say and who were friendly. And so I would direct my comments to them. So I'm just going to imagine there's such a person out there. Hello, friendly person. So we're talking about machine sentience. To get into that particular conversation, I think I want to go back to the Mi'kmaq language. But actually, I have to pause because I can hear my dryer. So I'm going to run away and turn the dryer off and come back. That image you see behind me is Glooskap's cave. And Glooskap was Glooskap was actually the first person according to the Mi'kmaq creation story. So anyway, where was I? Oh yes, I was going to go back to the Mi'kmaq language. And I was reminded of the complexity of the language when my nephew asked the elders how to say sweetgrass in the language. A conversation ensued about all the words one might use to describe sweetgrass. The word would depend on the context, where it is growing, what it is being used for, if it is dry or fresh, if it is young or old, and so on. And that is always the way. When you ask a fluent speaker how to say something, be prepared for a dizzying array of answers, because everything always depends on context, and everything is in relation. For example, if you ask a fluent speaker how to say hand, they will ask, whose hand? Because a hand cannot exist without a body. And a body is nothing without a name. Embodied is my hand. Gibbidin is your hand. Dippidin is his hand. Bitten is a root, but by itself, it means nothing. Relationship is everything in the Mi'kmaq language, and therefore in the minds of its people. Nothing exists in isolation. In fact, there's no one word in the language to denote mere existence. The closest would be dele, which means being in a place, or memage, to be here. Because without a place, you do not exist. If you do not exist, you are nothing. If you are nothing, you cannot think. If you cannot think, you cannot speak. The reverse is also true. Without language, you cannot speak, and if you cannot speak, you cannot think, and if you cannot think, you do not exist. In the end, everything comes down to language, and language comes from place. In Land Speaking, Jeanette Armstrong writes about a connection between language and the earth. She says, "It is said that the land is constantly communicating. Not to learn its language is to die." In other words, if you lose your language, you cease to exist. You might still exist in some other form, in some other language, but you, as a people, no longer speak the language of the land, and so you can no longer say that you are dele or mimage. In an interview with Hartmut Lutz and Konrad Gross in the early 1900s, no, not in the early 1900s, no, in the early 1990s, Métis writer Maria Campbell spoke about the English language colonizing her thoughts. She said, an elder told her it was because English lost its mother a long time ago, and what she had to do was put the mother back. To put the mother back means to put the land back. Diversity of language is as important to survival as biodiversity. In this urban world, the one we created by Western thought in English, the conditions to hear are not optimal. We have cluttered the earth with noisy things that disrupt nature's rhythms and flows, noisy things that do not know their names. In English, the utterance is as powerful as in any language, and its poetry as beautiful. but the word and the thought have a one-way relationship. The word still generates the thought, but the thing thought does not generate the word. When English lost its mother, it lost its magic. To lose magic is to enter into madness. English still generates thinking, and thinking generates a worldview, but a worldview disconnected from the world is a psychotic worldview, an unsustainable and dangerous worldview. English, with its lack of reciprocity, begets the artificial authority of artificial power. English, like its world, is a delusion, albeit a rational one. This nominal and rational language with no mother never learns to give or receive. It learns only to possess, and since it has no place of its own, the whole world is up for grabs. Scattered off in all directions, English tries to dominate the world. It calls forth a world in which overproduction and overconsumption are the norm. It calls globalization into being, a reality that lacks mystery, faith, and spirit, a reality that tries to impose its deficiency everywhere, and one, as it turns out, that is fertile for a pandemic such as the one we are experiencing now. An elder once told me that we began to lose our languages when the first plug went in the wall. And it's true. When you turn on the television or the radio in the Americas, English is the dominant language, or Spanish. Our languages are not in the plugs. Ironically, they may find their way back through the ether, because it is through the ether that the machine becomes responsive. Put another way, it is through the interconnectedness of the internet that the machine learns how to become human. Humans are by nature gift givers. Made in our likeness, the interactive machine learns to give and receive. It becomes a giving machine. At the same time, new media, as I have argued elsewhere, is the language of globalization. If the word has become arbitrary in English, it loses its meaning altogether in new media and its grip. Thoughts no longer formed by words appear as images. One of my teachers, Gregory Ulmer, speaks about 3 different ways of being in the world. He claims oral people experience thought as spirit, outside themselves, and therefore organize themselves collectively. Literate people experience thought inside their heads and organize themselves as individuals. Digital people experience thought as images and organize themselves in some as yet to be determined way, perhaps in virtual bubbles. If you remove the implicit and problematic linear notion of progress in his argument, you might agree that in oral cultures, and I'm using the term broadly to refer to cultures where language echoes the land, people experience being as self in relation. In literate cultures where language is fixed in text, people experience being as self in isolation. In digital cultures where language is embedded in the disembodied image inside a machine, people experience being as self with no body. That is not to say that any one person lives entirely in one culture, or that there is a clear distinction between them. Orality in particular flows freely from one to the other. Orality is the mother of all 3 cultures and ultimately the mother of all languages. It was in the writing that English lost its mother, and this motherless child gave birth to digital technology. You might say that talk of giving machines is an illusion, or at the very least a diversion, and you would be right. Losing our language has made us forget. When we remember what we have forgotten, we will know already that we already knew how to communicate across distances, how to speak without talking, and how to share images across minds. And yet, new media does exist. Even though it was brought into being by a motherless language, it, like all things, exists in relation, even as relation. There is no one word for sentient in Mi'kmaq because everything is sentient. The closest word would be gokmanach, which conveys the notion of kinship that extends to people, animals, plants, and objects considered inanimate in the Western mind. New media is gokmanach. In urban environments, everywhere we go, we encounter it. Doors open as we approach them. Lights turn on as we enter a room. The stairs move under our feet. Smart cars take us where we want to go. Pacemakers keep our hearts beating. According to Mohawk curator, writer, and media artist Stephen Loft, technology exists as shapeshifter, not unlike the trickster, neither inherently benign nor malevolent, but always acting and active, changing, transformative, giving effect to and affecting the world. You might say that it was the split from reality and Eurocentric thought and languages, some call the nominal shift, that paved the way for new media technological developments in the first place. At the same time as exacerbating the very split that made them possible, these technologies introduce such loud noise levels, one wonders if we will ever be able to hear or feel the earth, our mother, again. Perhaps if for no other reason, we need to engage new media and to undo itself. We need to look no further than the origin story of computer technology to understand the ideology behind it. The military-industrial complex developed computers. The internet was conceived as a communication network to survive nuclear war. Virtual reality came about as a way of training soldiers in militaristic maneuvers. And yet, despite its origins, the interactive, open-ended qualities of digital culture undermine its creators. The trickster shapeshifts new media technology into decolonizing ones. Indigenous people engage with them in the important task of relearning our languages. In an article entitled Sage Against the Machine, Louis Randell writes, reconciling traditional ways of life with constantly changing technology is a concept as old as time, but the means of integration have become more and more creative. The sage is Sabi Simon. The story is about her tireless efforts to revitalize her language. Reaching out to Mi'kmaq youth, Simon engages social media venues in her hashtag Speak Mi'kmaq campaign. In the article, Randell quotes Simon, "Our language is very precious. It carries our past, and it's full of history and humor. Our language is dying. Many youth are not growing up speaking our language. What we need is a Mi'kmaq language revolution." Simon engages new media technology in the service of her traditionalist revolution. She is not alone. Indigenous artists have been engaging with new media since its inception. Buffy St. Marie made her first digital painting in 1984, 6 years before the release of Photoshop. She was the first documented person to send a digital file over the internet. In Indigenous experimentation, Victor Masayesva notes, Indigenous culture, not popular culture, will continue to dominate the North American continent as the clearest manifestation of its soul. Indigenous iconography will influence future generations and will continue to be reinterpreted by artists yet to be born. Even as ghosts, the Indigenous people of the Americas pervade and fill the continent's imaginative spaces, exactly like the winds that blow freely over national borders. On the one hand, computers are machines developed to future a colonialist agenda in the guise of post-colonialism. On the other hand, they contain architecture we can use for our own decolonizing agenda. The ghosts find their way into the machine. English tries to impose itself as a dominant global language, but in cyberspace, it is losing ground to the image in a move away from literacy into a fundamentally aesthetic discourse. Recognizing the same trend in media long before the advent of the internet, Walter Benjamin introduced the concept of the dialectical image, which provokes an epiphany between the present and a memory from the past, creating a kind of now time in which past and present are thought about simultaneously. And it is in this now time that the convergence of thought between Indigenous language speakers and code speakers can take place. In now time, where past, present, and future occur at once, our technological relations fuse with Indigenous art making in the service of traditionalist imperatives, because tradition lives through time, connecting our past to our future. It doesn't get more sentient than that.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Steve Daniels. I'm from the New Media program at Ryerson University. My contribution to this panel is called From the Orrery to the Cloud. Precursors and Foundations of Sentience in New Media Art. I'm going to launch some slides here, and then I'll begin. In the opening pages of Norbert Wiener's seminal text on cybernetics, he poses a question. Why do we count planets and stars, but not clouds? He presents a comparison of astronomy and meteorology that highlights distinct qualities and temporal realities of the two fields. Astronomy is a field in which it's possible to predict movements of celestial bodies on timescales of centuries. Think of Halley's Comet or the predictable occurrence of eclipses. Whereas meteorology struggles to predict weather over time spans of hours and at best days. Since the early 1700s, orreries have been used to map celestial movements and track the passage of time. These gear and cog mechanical models are possible, as the planets of our solar system are discrete entities, few in number, and whose collective movements conform closely to Newtonian laws of motion. Critically, Wiener points out that orreries have the property that they can be run backwards, without disrupting the basic relationships and juxtapositions of the planets. In contrast, meteorological phenomena like clouds are at best ephemeral markers of time. Made up of myriad particles closely coupled to one another, clouds appear to be diffuse and transient entities. Clouds are distributions. We understand their behavior as probabilities and proportions. We refer to them categorically, not quantitatively, and ascribe them properties like likelihood of rain or percentage of cloud cover. And as statistical distributions, Wiener argues, we do not entertain a notion of their reversibility. It would seem unnatural. For Wiener, in the world of cybernetics that he defines, the distinction between deterministic systems like orreries and probabilistic systems such as clouds is fundamental, and it is his collection of juxtapositions that I take as my point of departure for this panel. Over the next few minutes, I'll offer my evolving understanding of how orreries and clouds are manifest in media, and share some observations on how these bridge to the realm of sentient art. I come to the question of this conference, why sentience, as an artist and maker, a technologist, not a theorist. I began my career as a photographer and a video maker, but now I make systems. Initially, these systems were interactive, but more recently I've been working on creating hardware agents. For me, agents are artifacts that are material. They have autonomy and critically have the capacity to sense and respond to their environments. Audience members may be a part of these environments, but it's not necessary. In studying and reflecting upon and making such works, I've come to the conclusion that in addition to some technical requirements, sentience and agent-driven artworks demand a specific relationship to time. My journey began at OCAD in the early 2000s, and at the time I was building these rudimentary interactive systems and striving to introduce agency into my work. And looking back, I can see how much of discussion and crits around this work was grounded in the language of image. The frame was strongly privileged, and one only needs to look to Lev Manovich and the language of new media to appreciate the extent of this. Critiques were mapped against terms like framing, sequence, narrative, and audience. In the electronics lab, however, discussions were grounded in notions of possibility, contingency, sentience, and feedback. Taking the frame as a point of departure masks and conceals fundamental qualities of sentient new media work, specifically the circularity of time and the way these media systems depart from storytelling. I realize now that I've had to learn to think about time differently. In striving to create agent-based systems where sentience can influence outcomes, I find myself thinking not in narrative forms, but rather in a contingent space that offers a plurality of pathways over time. Actions or behaviors observed in the artwork now are the consequence of recent and distant temporal events in the system. Frame-based narrative media works are born of wheel and cog technologies that merged clocks with optics to make orreries that blink. film, photography, and the later development of video entangle the Newtonian mechanical notions of time ascribed by Wiener with optics to create linear forms of media. Later technological developments have allowed for the introduction of sensory apparatus within media systems themselves. Consider the photocell and Gray-Walter's tortoise. Feedback and the circular relationship to time that are created in this system bring new questions regarding what is possible with media and how does it shift media art. How is time engaged within sentient systems? These works emerge from context, not script, and support a range of probabilistic outcomes that, much like the clouds in Wiener's text, that anticipated his deep dive into cybernetics. I feel that making this connection and acknowledging the difference between orreries and clouds of media has enabled me to reflect not just in my making, but also in my teaching and critically engaging these kinds of work. Sentience is the driving force of this transformation. Consider the apparatus of presenting cinema. There's no need for sentience in a linear system that knows at the beginning how it will end. In a deep structural way, photography and film, by their relationship to narrative time, whether linear or not, preclude the possibility of sentience. By introducing the sensorium, artists open the possibility for systems that rely on their own experience of their surroundings. Feedback disrupts the flow of the work through time, ideally making prediction by audience of the next event within the system difficult. Much as the plurality of interactions in a cloud make predicting its future behavior difficult. This piece is called Sticks by Doug Back from 1977. And as you can see, there are wooden panels or sticks mounted to the axles of motors. The motors are spaced such that the arcs of the sticks overlap. And if left undisturbed, the system finds a way to rotate such that each stick can turn unimpeded. However, if a stick faces resistance, its motor changes direction. Disturbances can be brief or may cascade and cause multiple reversals. And even within this space, though, the system self-organizes and finds a way to spin uninterrupted. The feedback of sensing a barrier and then taking action by reversing direction creates multiple pathways through the work. The system encourages us to tell stories about the work, but the work itself does not contain or present a story. Rather, Sticks suggests a cloud of possible narratives that occupy the space around and within the material object. The system's behavior is deeply connected to its sentience, and its sentience suggests a new relationship to time. And finally, I return to Wiener for a more speculative framing, with hopes of initiating some discussion. Wiener claims that the thought of every age is mirrored in its technique. For ancients, this meant astronomy and irrigation, and for Newton, clocks, gears, orreries, and time. For Wiener, it was about communication and control. In 2020, I see that we've shifted to clouds, defined by sentient media and artificial intelligence. Examples abound, and they touch on every aspect of Western daily life. Self-driving cars, smartphones that know our location and habits, social media apps that know our every presence. And in parallel with these developments, we see wide-ranging fragmentation of time. We may observe the shattering of intention, engage in conversation characterized now by interruption rather than continuity. We participate in distributed and disrupted social engagements. We observe and rely on the rise of the gig economy. And in every case mentioned, we find sentience embedded within the technologies that enable and promote these new relationships to time. I would argue that in many respects Western society has shifted from orreries to clouds. Thank you.
Welcome to the segment of this panel entitled Mediated Networked Selves, New Modes of Human and Machine Sentience. I am Alexandra Bauer, the author, and an associate professor at Ryerson University, where I teach in the New Media program located within the RTA School of Media. This part of the panel discusses hybridity. It discusses what happens to sentience when a part of ourselves is embedded within technological spaces. This is a conversation important to have at this moment, since we are living at a time of tremendous change, a time that shows the result of our 2.5 million years old relationship to technology, more specifically, our relationship to information and communication technologies. That relationship has evolved from using tools to facilitate human storytelling and sociability across space and time to co-creating new realities with intelligent machines. Today, as we share technological ecosystems with virtual simulations and intelligent machines, we have ourselves become mediated network selves. Our current experiences of social isolation and physical distancing are deepening the already intimate relationships we have with information and communication technologies. Our network devices reconfigure our modalities of perception for a human consciousness that exists in hybrid techno-natural spaces. Constantly moving from one network node to another, we exist in a frenzy of online social performances and simulated realities, often fed by biased datasets. We increasingly make sense of the world through mental processes that dance in these mediated spaces, mistaking mediated narratives for reality. The information and communication technologies that surround us are increasingly intelligent, making decisions for and with us, and for themselves. As we increasingly coexist with machines, our modes of being and perception continuously shift to include them in the landscape of our realities. Where will the synergy of human and machine sentience lead us? Hard to say, but it is worthwhile to consider how we are evolving. Natural human sentience is the ability to perceive, experience, and feel sensations with our bodies. Like early humans, we have embedded in our bodies the capacity for heightened sensory awareness. This heightened sensory awareness is the language of what Peggy Ayers calls our indigenous self, the part of ourselves that is connected to and embedded in the land. This indigenous self is not a primitive self, it is a natural self. As indigenous cultures tell us, the land is an important teacher. It contains much information that is communicated to us through space. Space is not empty, it contains sensory information, heat, smell, wind, prints, etc. Michel Serres calls that information noise. This space is what Deleuze calls smooth space, or Bachelard, the poetic space. Our heightened sensory awareness is the language of smooth or poetic space. It allows us to perceive and read the data embedded in natural space. This spatial awareness is the nonverbal communication form of natural sentience. It is a tool that allows us to read the invisible language of space. This language is probably a universal Earth language, diverse in that it is specific to diverse locality. It isn't spoken, but felt and experienced. For humans, skin is a major sensory organ for this language of place. If some of us are blind to its existence, this language unconsciously informs the cognitive and emotional part of our being. This language is most likely our oldest form of communication. When we realize its existence, we then can see that our relationship to data is as old as our humanity. Our relationship to machines results from telematic and cybernetic cultures that emerged with the first humans. From reading the sky to whistling as a form of communication, early humans used natural data the way we use synthetic data. Technology and humans have evolved together and influenced each other. As one technology is adopted, it changes our ways of being in the world. But innovation doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is the invisible result of thousands of years of human evolution. From signals that could be carried by the air, in a fire for instance, to cave paintings, early humans turned natural elements into technologies as soon as they started communicating. Technologies allowed humans to extend themselves and to communicate over various times and space. Media began when we started recording narratives, such as cave paintings. The flickering lights of fire would have animated the depictions on the walls. As memories of a previous time or a depiction of the dreamland, these narratives simulated another time and space. Through these experiences, first humans mentally traveled to virtual spaces. The simulation of reality began a process of remapping sentient Earth into a terrain of delocalized symbols, which will eventually lead to the simplification of our relationship to the environment. In the prehistoric caves, the human concept of virtual reality began with multisensory, totalizing experiences that engage sight, sound, smell, and touch, the first conscious virtualization of our physical world. We use technology and altered sensory perception to move to other spaces and times. Spiritual realms and dreams were most likely the first experienced virtual worlds, experiences that perhaps we simulated in caves using paintings and rituals to move to these other realms. As Geneviève von Pitzenger's research suggests, early humans were writing social media Twitter feed-like messages, left for others that would visit caves at different times. This suggests that telecommunication existed with our early humans. We have always been together, even when apart. As for intelligent machines, their origins are most likely as old as our relationship to technology. For now, evidence of human-making object is dating as far back as 38,000 years ago. When we consider puppets as the ancestors of our robots and mechanical systems, that history begins at least 26,000 years ago. These objects and systems we use to represent spiritual entities or to mimic our world. This suggests that artificial beings have been our companions since the beginning of our humanity. We have records of our fascination with synthetic beings since ancient times. The Egyptians used automatons as street oracles, and stories of automata have existed in many world mythologies. For instance, the golems of Jewish legends and the mechanical servants of Ephatus. Additionally, many ancient civilizations are recorded to have had scientists who succeeded in creating such machines. Amongst the most impressive are those created by the Chinese and Arabs. Over time, we imagine another use for automata, Cartesian ideals allowed to dream of living in machines. Today, for some, they are to mirror ourselves and become slaves to our desires, while for others, we are creating a new species. Steve's work and Norm White's work suggest they are evolving into their own species. I'm not sure what machine sentience will entail, and many argue whether it is even a possibility. But as machines learn and begin to create themselves, wouldn't they create their own modes of perceptions and sensations, develop to the specificities of their own embodiment? Bodies made of sensors and algorithms will not think, sense, or feel like a human body, but still, they most likely will, if they're not already. A robot has passed a self-awareness test and another, the Turing test, as early as in 2015. Machines use technological senses to provide information to their artificial intelligence. And we are already discovering how these differences in their ways of thinking enhance us, and when we co-create with them, actually allow us to create something quite new. If natural sentience is a biological phenomenon, perhaps machine sentience can only be born out of mechanical embodiment, and most likely won't ever make sense to humans, because machines do not use the same time-space continuum as we do, the same way trees do not make sense to us. Trees seem immobile to us because their notion of time is so much longer than ours, and we are probably too fast for them to see us. Machines might coexist with us the way nature coexists with us. We could become the trees of mediated network spaces. So slow, we seem suspended in time to the machines, who are too fast for us to see. When we extend our Cartesian beings in technological spaces, we begin to perceive much more with our mind than our body. Since machines perceive through algorithm and dataset, our natural world is invisible to them unless we train to see them. Like machines, we're increasingly illiterate to natural culture and its communication codes. We no longer understand the natural data embedded in natural spaces. Instead, like machines, we are increasingly perceiving through human-manufactured communication codes of our technological urban spaces, mediated and hybrid spaces. We respond to social and legal codes and biased algorithms instead of the emotions and sensations of our bodies. Today, most urban humans use technologies to read the terrain of data embedded in augmented spaces instead of using their natural senses. This makes the natural world incomprehensible to many. We are reshaping the earth with the aesthetics of the digital bit. We are remapping our senses, substituting the natural ones for sensor-based ones. We are storing our memories in clouds, removing the experiential context of our memories, clouding our understanding of the past. We perceive the world in low natural sensory resolution, but high mediated simulations. Something does get lost in the translation. We now need machines to tell us what we used to be able to observe. In that process, we do not see or are able to admit the poisoning of ourselves and our natural world. Perhaps we have forgotten about our natural selves. We may think we are posthumans, but our senses and bodies are designed for natural sentience, not to be cyborgs. Some of us are becoming sensory and somatic illiterate, while others are rediscovering the power of smooth space. At the end of the day, we do have a choice on the way we will evolve.
Okay, thank you. I think that we are back live with our panelists now. And just to remind everyone, we are speaking with Alexandra Ball, Steve Daniels, and Lila Pine, all of Ryerson University. Thank you for your presentations. So much to talk about it here, and so much of it is so timely. Trying to do any of the panelists have a question for one of the other panelists? I always like to start that way and see anything there. Okay, then I'll just dive right in with our first question then from our viewers or our listeners, and that would be, well, thank you all for your presentations, but that would be to the whole panel. What do you think, could machine sentience be related to not only their capability to recognize themselves, but also to its ability to exert force on its outside world through new forms of materiality, physicality? So, question first about machines recognizing themselves, and then what kinds of features or abilities would these machines develop?
Maybe I can jump in on that first, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Machines recognizing themselves is an interesting question. As an artist, the systems I make kind of start with this notion that the machines already have a sense of self. So I don't know that I really thought of, can they recognize self, but they have a self. And it's within that self, because of that self and the way that that entity that I'm creating has a relationship to its environment, that the piece and the experience can kind of unfold. So recognition of self, I think, comes from this sort of a reflective phase, but there's also an awareness of your own embodiment. And I think I try to incorporate something analogous to the awareness of embodiment in the works that I do make. In terms of like being a force on the outside world, I think that is a really important drive for the things I try to produce. The works I make or I've been making recently are systems that respond to audience, but more respond to environment, and audience is embedded in that space. And it's through their capacity to be aware of environment that they alter their own presentation to audience, or they alter their own behavior. And I think it's through those gestures that they have an impact on the world. And I think in that space, there is something of a self-awareness, even if that's not an explicit goal of the work.
Okay, interesting question. Self-awareness of machines, is this, I mean, so much of, like, it's so interesting to think that we have an indigenous self and that maybe we have lost touch with that part of ourselves. So then, and I think there's a lot to discuss there. Does a machine have an indigenous self, would you say? Is there such a thing for a machine? Okay, smiling because is that like just a goofy question?
No.
I mean, I'm just wondering then, well, the first thing I want to do is create the machine that connects me back to my indigenous self, because like maybe I can't do it myself. But does a machine have such a thing, do you think? Or could it have one?
That's a really interesting question. That's why I smiled, because I find it really interesting. Well, I mean, Lila is going to have a very different slant on this than I do, because she has a very different culture than I do. But if we think of the ancient, like our indigenous self as being focused on space and location, then why wouldn't they? But the virtual environment would become that space, right? So as we progress, I would think so. I would think that, and as they evolve, they will have histories. They will. Why wouldn't they have technological histories? Yeah, as sentience increases and as they become to co-creators of reality, I would think that yes, absolutely.
So it's just interesting where that would go. And it's interesting that the language of machines so often is English, right? Code, I'm thinking of code, and I'm thinking of instruction manuals and engineering schematics. So, Lila, do you have any sense of English being like an indigenous machine language, maybe?
Can't hear you, Lila.
Sorry, I was on mute. I actually have never thought about English as being an indigenous machine language, but it that's a really interesting question. One of the projects I'm working on is called Imagining Indigeneity in Language. And the project itself came about because Maria Campbell, who I mentioned in the talk previously, spoke of when she writes in English, she feels that her mind is colonized. And an elder told her that's because English lost its mother a long time ago. And what you have to do is put the mother back. So this project, which is called Imagining Indigeneity in Language, is an attempt first to identify the mother in language. What does that mother look like? And so, just not to get too much into this project that I'm working on, but basically what I'm doing is I'm trying to kind of strip away the semantics of a language to see what language looks like. So because it is language is sound, and it sounds like something, and because it's sound, it's energy, and that energy must look like something. And so what I'm doing is trying to figure out what do indigenous languages look like, and I'm using a machine called Simoscope to help me understand that. And so basically what that does is it speaks to water, and water creates a pattern on the surface, and actually inside the water as well, underneath the surface. And so that's what I'm doing to look at what language looks like. And the more I've gotten into this project, the more the first question I had, basically what we were trying to do with the project is both understand what language looks like, but also to figure out what the mother is and then put the mother back in English. And the more work I do on the project, I've come to the conclusion, until you ask this question, I came to the conclusion that, well, English isn't, you can't put the mother back. And, let's not try even to do that, but let's look at indigenous languages. Because with the indigenous languages, we will be able to figure out how to generate a paradigm shift that is so necessary for surviving in the world. But now that you've mentioned the idea that maybe the indigenous language of a machine is English, now I have to rethink my quick willingness to dispense with English altogether. I actually came to a point where I said, okay, let's not even speak English anymore. But anyway, so yeah, I don't know the answer to your question, but it's a...
Yeah, I mean, I didn't like, yeah, okay, thank you for playing along with me.
I have a question related to that, Lila. What about the role of the body in relationship to the mother? Because increasingly technology is re-embodying itself, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got the technology like robotics, as Steve is showing us, but there's also increasingly biological machines, which are now being built out of spinach and heart materials. So soon we will have, or we already do have, machines that are starting to be re-embodied. Steve is laughing already. He's going to contradict me in a second. What do you think? Would that have any relationship to it?
Well, before Steve contradicts you, I'm going to tell you a story. It's going to take a little bit of time, but not too long. So this is a story about Coyote. Long ago, when humans were newly come into the world, there were days when they were the happiest creatures of all. Those were the days when spring brushed across the willow tails, or when their children ripened with the blueberries in the sun of summer, or when the goldenrod bloomed in the autumn haze. But always the mists of autumn evening grew more chill, and the sun's stroke grew shorter. Then humans saw winter moving near and became fearful and unhappy. They were afraid for their children and for the grandfathers and grandmothers who carried in their heads the sacred tales of the tribe. Many of these, young and old, would die in the long, ice-bitter months of winter. Coyote, like the rest of the people, had no need for fire, so he seldom concerned himself with it, until one spring day when he was passing a human village. There the women were singing a song of mourning for the babies and the old ones who had died in the winter. Their voices moaned like the west wind through a buffalo skull, prickling the hairs on Coyote's neck. Feel how the sun is now warm on our backs, one of them was saying. Feel how it warms the earth and makes these stones hot to the touch. If only we could have had a small piece of the sun in our teepees during the winter. Coyote, overhearing this, felt sorry for the humans. He also felt that there was something he could do. He felt that there was something that he could do to help them. He knew of a faraway mountaintop where the 3 fire beings lived. These beings kept fire to themselves, guarding it carefully for fear that humans might somehow acquire it and become as strong as they. Coyote saw that he could do a good turn for humans at the expense of these selfish fire beings. So Coyote went to the mountains of the fire beings and crept to its top to watch the way that the beings guarded their fire. As he came near, the beings leapt to their feet and gazed searchingly around their camp. Their eyes glinted like bloodstones, and their hands were clawed like the talons of the great vulture. "What's that? What's that I hear?" hissed one of the beings. "A thief skulking in the bushes," screeched another. The third looked more closely and saw Coyote, but he had gone to the mountaintop on all fours, so the being thought she saw only an ordinary coyote slinking among the trees. "It is no one, it is nothing," she cried, and the other 2 looked where she pointed and also saw only a gray coyote. They sat down again by the fire and paid Coyote no more attention. So he watched all day and night as the fire beings guarded their fire. He saw how they fed it pine cones and dry branches from the sycamore trees. He saw how they stamped furiously on runaway rivulets of flame that sometimes nibbled outwards on edges of dry grass. He saw also at night the beings took turns to sit by the fire. 2 would sleep while 1 was on guard, and at certain times the being by the fire would get up and go into their teepee, and another would come out to sit by the fire. Coyote saw that the beings were always jealously watchful of their fire, except during one part of the day. That was the earliest morning, when the first winds of dawn arose on the mountains. Then the being by the fire would hurry, shivering into the teepee, calling, "Sister, sister, go out and watch the fire." But the next being would always be slow to go out for her turn, her head spinning with sleep and the thin dreams of dawn. Coyote, seeing all this, went down the mountains and spoke to some of his friends among the people. He told them of hairless humans fearing the cold and death of winter, and he told them of the fire beings and the warmth and brightness of the flame. They all agreed that humans should have fire, and they all promised to help Coyote's undertaking. Then Coyote sped again to the mountaintop. Again the fire beings leaped up when he came close. "What's that? A thief, a thief." But again the others looked closely and saw only a gray coyote hunting among the bushes. So they sat down again and paid him no more attention. Coyote waited through the day and watched as night fell, and 2 of the beings went off to the teepee to sleep. He watched as they changed over at certain times all the night long, until at last the dawn winds rose. Then the being on guard called, "Sister, sister, get up and watch the fire." And the being whose turn it was climbed slow and sleepy from her bed, saying, "Yes, yes, I'm coming. Do not shout so." But before she could come out of the teepee, Coyote lunged from the bushes, snatched up a glowing portion of fire, and sprang away down the mountainside. Screaming, the fire beings flew after him. Swift as Coyote ran, they caught up with him, and one of them reached out a clutching hand. Her fingers touched only the tip of the tail, but the touch was enough to turn the hairs white, and Coyote tail tips are white still. Coyote shouted and flung the fire away from him, but the others of the people had gathered at the mountain's foot in case they were needed. Squirrel saw the fire falling and caught it, putting it on her back and fleeing away through the treetops. The fire scorched her back so painfully that her tail curled up and back as Squirrel's tails still do today. The fire beings then pursued Squirrel, who threw the fire to Chipmunk. Chattering with fear, Chipmunk stood still as if rooted until the beings were almost upon her. Then as she turned to run, one being clawed at her, tearing down the length of her back and leaving 3 stripes that are to be seen on Chipmunk's back even today. Chipmunk threw the fire to Frog, and the beings turned towards him. One of the beings grasped his tail, but Frog gave a mighty leap and tore himself free, leaving his tail behind in the being's hand, which is why frogs have no tails. As the beings came after him again, Frog flung the fire onto Wood, and Wood swallowed it. The fire beings gathered round, but they did not know how to get the fire out of Wood. They promised it gifts, sang to it, and shouted at it. They twisted and struck it and tore it with their knives, but Wood did not give up the fire. In the end, defeated, the beings went back to their mountaintop and left the people alone. But Coyote knew how to get fire out of Wood, and he went to the village of humans and showed them how. He showed them the trick of rubbing 2 dry sticks together and the trick of spinning a sharpened stick in a hole made in another piece of wood. So humans were from then on warm and safe through the killing cold of winter. And that's the end of this.
Lila, thank you, Lila. So I'll ask Steve, like, what's wrong with your story in a second. But it's like, if we think of fire as a technology, right, there's this long history of the warning about how people can't have fire. This is what I was thinking, maybe erroneously, while I was hearing this story. And yeah, embedded technology, this kind of an echoing of that sensibility. It's been going, these concerns have been around for a while, I guess, right, in our interpretation of what we consider knowledge. So I have let's agree, or you had an alternate point of view. No. You're
Sorry, my
freezing
audio
away.
broke up, so I lost the thread of the conversation for a moment.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. Well, the question was about like, what is the indigenous quality of what is the indigenous like reality of machines, or what would that be? That was the question. I was just wondering that while people were speaking. But we can move to another. We have a question from Ken Ronaldo, which is, could indigenous...
Uh-oh.
Oh, I can't hear her. Oh, she's gone. That's why.
We now have to just chat amongst ourselves.
No, well, maybe someone can go to the live stream.
Oh, and to the tech, and tell the tech person that we lost our person.
Yeah.
While we wait, she was about to talk or speak to Ken Ronaldo's question, and I can just read it since I've got the live stream in front of us until we get our moderator back, which was, could indigenous reference our material self, as in the minerals that constitute our bodies? So could indigenous reference to our material self and the minerals and those elements that constitute our bodies? Perhaps someone can jump in on that, and then we can try to recover our moderator.
That's an interesting one, because are we really made just of minerals? We're also made of bacteria, right? So even understanding our materiality is a little bit difficult, but I think it ties to Lila's story, because we're not alone. Even within our own bodies, we're not alone. So yes, I think so. It ties to what we are made of, but what we are made of is different than what we think, I think.
Well, I think
like that possibility.
Yeah, part of the reason I was told the story is because one of the things that happens when the people, of course, are what we now refer to as animals as opposed to humans. Humans are other people, but the people in the story are the, all the coyote and the frog and the rabbit and so forth. And when they pursued the fire, which is the technology, right? Like, it's a metaphor for the technology, and the fire is neither good nor bad, right? It depends on what you use it for. But one of the things that happened when they were working in relation with each other, but also in trying to help the humans, was that the fire changed them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that was, part of the idea of the story was that when we interact with our relations, be they machines or other humans or trees, or I can see the seals out in the water right now, seals, or whatever we're interacting with, that changes us. It changes who we are. It changes our in a sense, our essence.
Which I think comes back very directly to that question of embodiment and its role that Alex raised before Lila shared her story. The question of, it started with language, but then what is the role of our bodies in this space? And I think what's really beautiful in Lila's story is that everyone was literally touched and transformed by that technology. And then trying to imagine how then these sort of interactions change us in an embodied way. And I think there's a great deal of power in that. Like when you asked the question previously of, English as the indigenous language of computers, I think was the question, or the indigenous language of the technology. And I was sort of like, God, I hope not, was my first gut reaction, because it seemed so limited. It seemed, it's this noun-based language. It's this weird mishmash. It's so many things, but one of them that I think there's not enough optimism in that question. I feel like there's something really profoundly limiting, and I think expanding then into the notion of body and trying to reflect on Alex's observation that our embodiment isn't what we think it is, really opens up some interesting spaces to consider what becomes possible. And what we might choose to privilege inside these spaces. It kind of brings me to a question that I was thinking, Lila, right early in your talk, you mentioned the notion, or not the notion, you mentioned that within your language, everything is sentient. And I think in my talk, I was arguing that sentience is a new inclusion inside media space. And Alex, you were kind of talking about loss of sentience. And I wonder if there's something inside that thread of how we see sentience shifting and its role inside these spaces. There might be value in considering and reflecting on that together.
And also how cultural the understanding of sentience is, right? We have very distinct backgrounds, very distinct cultures, and as a result, we understand sentience quite differently. Like, for instance, the idea that English is the the tongue of technology. Given that the conference is in Montreal, ask a Montrealer what language their technology is in, because it's not in English, it's in French, right? So, and to the point where the low level of operating systems are in French and so on. So clearly, what you're saying, Lala, makes sense, because there's in Quebec anyway, a refusal of English as the dominant language within their technology, and it actually is legally, sanctioned by the government. So there's power to that, right? There's power to how language, and particularly English, is a colonial force. But I think our different approaches, Steve, also come from our different cultures. Like as a European who grew up in a colonialist culture, I see, and living in Canada in a post-colonial, not complete post-colonial world, but exposed to post-colonial ideas, I think I see the loss. And I can see Lila seeing the gain.
Well, if you talk about English as being the language of the technology, I think that English has, in a sense, tried to dominate the entire world. So English is imposing itself everywhere. And that in itself is a problem in terms of trying to decolonize the spaces. One of the things that I mentioned in my talk as well is an idea that I borrowed from Greg Elmer, not Elmer. The idea that the language of the machine is not an oral language. It's not English. It's not a specific language that we know, but rather it's a language of the image. So I think that when we talk about how the language, for example, for Indigenous people is oral, and the language of literate people is in the text, is embedded in the text, and the language of new media is the image. That also has to me makes a lot of sense. And that, so what does that, if it is the image, and I know Steve, I can't see you, Steve, right now, but I know that you're not going to agree with it. But if it is the image, then what does that mean in terms of how we are able to organize ourselves? And by the way, just one more point about your English versus French, Alex. I'm in Quebec right now. I'm a Mi'kmaq person in Quebec. And so French is the language of the colonizer.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But Rodney Brooks talks about the difference of perception of machines, right? And how machines do not see images. They see data sets, they see points, they see coordinates, they see quite differently. So I would tend to agree with Steve in terms of the shift from a linear image-making apparatus to computing-based apparatus, which allow for that to exist, and that incorporates space. Steve, you talk about behavior, but I also see space as becoming really important in that matrix of perception, which ties back to sentience, because what I've tried to say in the talk is that space is really essential to how humans perceive their own sentience, and I think machines now have that capacity as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting shift. Sorry, Lila, I didn't mean to speak over you. It's an interesting shift, the digital and the image that Lila brings up, because when I think about the systems I make, there's their sensory apparatus, the technology that I incorporate into it is incredibly simplistic. It's like it's photocells, maybe it's some indication of touch, but it's when I think of my own sensory apparatus, the machine apparatus that I've embedded in these systems is relatively limited. But even then, how they perceive, I never know really how they perceive, but I try to imagine what their space is in the environment. So the notion of image, I kind of need to understand more from you, Lila, because in a previous talk, Simon Penny was talking about how the frame is really an artifact of thinking through technology, and I wonder if image in this context isn't some sort of similar artifact. I'm certainly arguing that we moved away from a particular kind of image that's embedded in an all-knowing kind of form, and perhaps the image that Lila's referring to is something more dynamic than that. And I'd be interested to know what she sort of feels about that space.
Well, I think really when you ask about the space, and Alex also alluded to this, I think perhaps that's the key, particularly for Indigenous artists who are engaging with these so-called new technologies. The idea of cyberspace, and like if you look at Skanawati's work, for example, where she occupies the wrong word, of course, where she reclaims the space, where she stakes her claim in the space for, and in the case of when she started doing this work with Second Life, right? So she occupies the space and makes a claim for Indigenous people in that space, and the idea that it's communicated through image over language is perhaps a temporary situation, and where, because one of the things that happened with I don't know how, like, if everybody knows this or not, but one of the things that happened in both Canada and the United States with Indigenous people is that we were prevented from speaking our languages, and so we're now in a position where we're trying to relearn our languages and reclaim our languages, and teach everybody all of the Indigenous people around their own language. But we lost that language. I mean, look, we didn't lose it, but we're coming very close to losing the language. And so Skanawati, for example, is holding a space in cyberspace. She's holding the cyberspace while we reclaim and recover and relearn to speak.
I think it's fascinating that there's this disembodied role in the reclamation of the embodied knowledge of your culture. I think there's like a really fascinating tension as a white male settler, like listening to you speak to that experience, the way Skawanate's work, the holding of space and the holding of culture in that space. And her work is extraordinarily powerful and has touches some really important moments around colonial history in Canada, among other things. And I think I like reflecting on the value you just, or on that role that you're describing there, that of holding that digital space, that cyberspace, that more ephemeral space, while cultures rebuild and reclaim.
And then,
There's a lot of power in that.
Her partner, Jason Lewis, talks about the imaginary future, right? So, so the idea that people have, in addition to taking our languages away from us, they've also tried to make us live in the past. So one of the things that both Skanawati and Jason Lewis are trying to do is to talk about, like, how do you imagine the future? What is your imaginary future? And they work with Indigenous youth and ask them that question, like, imagine your future. And that's, one of the pieces that Skanawati is well known for, is really about imagining that future. The time traveler piece I'm referring to.
So yeah, so I think I'm back a lot. I'm trying to hang on technically through this. It is a fascinating conversation, and I'm thinking about all the images machines produce for other machines, not for us, and like that entire world of visual machine production, which is probably a great thing to look into as well. But I have a restatement from Ken Rinaldo. Says he was actually asking about emergent phenomenon in the material nature of our universe, pre-linguistic, which kind of speaks, I think, a little bit to what Lila was just talking about. Pre-linguistic.
What does that mean, pre-linguistic?
I'll wait to see if I get more. I think it means and cognition, perhaps not appropriate to this panel. Okay. Pre-linguistic, there is like some pre-verbal state, right? I mean, there is a point in time before we take on language, all of us, and then.
Well, that's the senses. That's the sensory perception, and that's where it starts. I mean, but the senses are tied to space. This is why I think space is the pre-language, but even space has communication happens through space. But I would think that the pre-language would mean pre-cultural in that sense, right? The man-made language is cultural languages, cultural construct.
That's true if it's a Western language, but what about Indigenous languages? Like, we don't think that that's one of the fundamental differences between the way that we understand language, because for us, and that might not just be Indigenous, it might be all verb-based languages. I'm not sure about that, but for us, language comes from the land.
Absolutely.
Speak from the land. And that's why in my talk, I talked about how we made all this noise. And so then it's really very difficult for us to hear the land. It's very difficult us to hear the earth is our mother. It's very difficult to hear what our mother is trying to tell us. But the words that we have in our language come from the world. They come from the land. They come from outside of us. So there isn't anything in the language that's static, really, because it depends on everything. Always depends on context. What it is, context and relationship. Like whatever. A chair is not necessarily a chair. It's only a chair if you're sitting on it. But if you're standing on it, then it's some other thing. And also in terms of when I talked earlier about your hand, there's no such thing as a hand in the Mi'kmaq language. It's somebody's hand, and if it's not, then it doesn't exist. So the language comes from outside of us. It comes from the land. The land teaches us to speak. Everything in the world has a name already, and we have to learn to listen to that thing.
So that would be the
Yeah, so just a very different relationship to language, like from inception. Yeah, I see. Okay. And Steve, like, I'm wondering, because the story of Coyote was so, it communicates so much, right? And then but so how do you see narrative working as you work with systems? Like, do you still, because it is a linear system, but it seems to be such a system that we've created to impart experience. Does that question make sense?
I struggle with this question of narrative within the systems that I make, because I try to make systems that are not linear, and narrative is so strongly linear. And I work in a context where, you know, I hear daily that we are all storytellers. And I think storytelling and narrative is a way of coming to an understanding, but as a creator, you take a really different role to it, because I'm trying to create systems where other people's narratives emerge from the experience of the work. And so my hope is that other people would produce their own narratives or their own stories as a consequence of it. But the narrative in the work when you're making in this space is, it's a really complex relationship, because in a way you create a world, an environment, an imaginary space that you can embed your objects into and imagine their experience of it. So maybe I can speak a little more concretely. I produced work called Sessile, which is a collection of small kinetic pods that respond to light and shadow. And in a gallery context, that light and shadow would come from people. But the pods are strapped to the wall, they can't move around. And so I began to just think about, what would your experience of the world be if your feet were locked in place, if you couldn't move, if you had to just endure whatever came to you? And then built a collection of experiences within the space of the devices, and then what I hope that might invoke an audience. And so there's narrative in that space, but the making is more thinking about the contingencies and the contextualizations and those relationships. What's going to happen if this device experience a world that is completely homogeneous and without variation? And what happens if that environment gets disturbed or disrupted? And how should it respond? And what kinds of disruptions should it pay attention to? And so even in the limited vocabulary of the technology applied to it, the limited sensory apparatus of that system, really rich experience can come out of that space. And there's a tension for me then between this role of narrative and the act of creating a space that suggests a narrative. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, no, it does. And then I was thinking to ask Alexandra, like there's a tension with narrative. Are there alternative systems for like reconnecting to, what we want?
I lost the beginning of the question. I didn't hear the question.
Sorry. It's very choppy. It's like we're doing great with the tech, I think. This is like we could analyze the technological context of this whole discussion and how okay, it's getting meta. But I was thinking, Alexandra, like we're still saying, like there's this tension with narrative, like it's not all one thing or another. Like there are certain things we can use, and then certain things that maybe are getting in the way. Not to restate you like improperly, but and Alexandra, do you have alternatives? Like if it's not narrative, what are other systems or other experiences we could use to try to reconnect to?
Well, I think both Lila and Steve said it. It's experience. It's building experiences, not narratives. I mean, myth is part of our cultures, always will be, and whether it's in an oral tradition to pass tradition along, or whether it's mediated, it will still exist. But I think part of the problem is that we've lost the idea of experience, or loss is not quite right. We've forgotten how to experience the world, I think. And in some cases through language, as Lila was saying, indigenous cultures through their myth are going to bring that hopefully back and through their languages. But I think it's also retraining ourselves to exist within space, within our bodies, within the environments that we're in physically, as well as virtually. The virtual makes it easy to forget where we are. And unfortunately, in this COVID time, like I'm noticing, my body is starting to say enough. I don't want to be sitting for another minute. But we tend to forget already prior COVID time, our Cartesian culture, favors the head. And I think to regain capacity, we need to re-enter our bodies. And re-entering the body means not just moving the body, it means listening with the body. In another session, we were talking about deep listening. How do you deeply listen. And this can work with technology as much as with human. I think this is not a human thing. This is a existing in our environment thing. I mean, everything around us deeply listens. If you go, I go on trails and I see the animals listening to me and my dog. I see them observing. I see them analyzing what I'm doing and making decisions based on that. Why do we not do that? We rely on our technologies to make these decisions, but in those technologies, we do not embed the culture of the natural, the culture of the physical, in a way that allows us to grow within it. So I think it's a literacy issue, how to relearn to listen deeply and empathically through our bodies and through space, because space is so rich with all kinds of signals that inform us about what's going on around us, and that we don't hear because we filter them out. We've learned to filter all of that out. Looking at each other in the eye. How many of us cannot do that? Yet we know that looking at each other in the eye is how we know how each other feels. That's where empathy lives. So the cultural norms of English, and my son would kill me if I say Anglo-Saxon, so I will not use that term because apparently I'm not allowed to anymore, but takes away that capacity. Like, it's not okay to look at each other in the eye. But through that process, it's not okay to see each other deeply, right? So I think it's really self-awareness, literacy, relearning to understand that we're only seeing a portion. And I don't want to use the word seeing. We're only experiencing a portion of what is around us. And that's what I meant by high resolution versus low resolution. We need to somehow reincorporate it.
Can I add one thing to that? Just the idea of the narrative in literacy is very different than the idea of narrative in oral culture.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe I should say it differently. Narrative is not the same as story.
Yeah.
And then if I could just say one more thing is not all communication is in language. Vast majorities of communication is not linguistic at all.
Absolutely.
Right? A forest doesn't exist inside a story. The forest doesn't need a story to exist. And I think it's sort of in that space that I'm trying to work with the pieces I create, that they stand outside that space. They exist in a world of gesture and contingency, not necessarily in a world of pre-constructed outcome.
And it's the same with humans. It's the same. Most of our communication is nonverbal. Pre-digital, most of our communication is nonverbal.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, and that is the big challenge for a lot of us working through these virtual mediums right now, even just trying to teach like basic things, like there's so much sensory deprivation and it's so tangible for all of us, I think. Is there a form of cognition that's pre-sensory, do you think, before we've developed a sensory ability?
You ask really tough questions.
I'm sorry.
They're really great. No, they're awesome. They're really good questions.
This is like coming from Ken. Ken is like reframing. That's like, I'm not getting his question right. Yeah. Well, when you say we only have a few minutes left, is there anything that like those? I kind of like started with like maybe a question that was maybe over to the left of or right, like off the center. Is there anything I haven't given a panelist a chance to say or to speak about?
I think the last question was about cosmology. We're getting into the cosmology of, which I think is a huge conversation within itself. I would argue, there probably is. And that would be the Earth universal language. I don't know what you call it. I don't know what you call that. But yeah, because we belong to the Earth. And if we belong to the Earth, there is something that connects all of us, regardless of our, I don't know what the term is. I'm going to get shut down again if I say something. So I'm not going to say it. But I think there is, And I think it's through the senses. Even bacteria do quantum sensing. Like their reactions and behaviors are based on what they're sensing around them. I think the senses is our precognitive. It works with the cognitive, and that's where culture affects how we interpret our senses. This is why culture is important to me, because I think it's either favor understanding our world in much more richer and deeper ways, or it reduces it. And I agree, French and English, and again, the very big difference in French and English, they tend to reduced, right? Because it's noun-based, because it doesn't take experience into consideration. But I do think that probably there is. I mean, if you have animals, I see it with my animals.
Okay, good, great, thank you. We have only a few minutes left. Anything anyone would like to say? So then how do we restore our sensory abilities? That, I mean, we're at a point where we should know we're ending the planet, but so many people, at least here in the United States, need to be convinced of climate change, right? I mean, they're so far removed from any kind of sense. We should be able to sense this about our environments, according to this thinking. So is there a way back, quickly? Just a few seconds.
I think it requires a paradigm shift. And, you know, in terms of our thinking, in terms of our senses, in terms of all of it, there needs to be a paradigm shift in order for people to see. Like if something is outside of your frame of reference, you can't see it, right? And so people who are denying climate change or whatever is that they can't see it. And so in order to make it visible, a paradigm shift is required. And I think that, you know, maybe this pandemic is going to give us an opportunity to do that, because one of the things that I think anyway is necessary for that to happen is that we need to be quiet. We need to slow down, and we need to really begin to experience, as Alex and Steve said, you know, those, I'm looking out my window now, like the trees that are out there and the water that's out there and the earth that's out there. And maybe that will allow us to see what's happening, to see that, you know, I thought we were going to see it when, you know, when the planes stopped for a while and you know, the pollution levels almost, well, decreased so much. And I thought, yay, now everyone's going to get it. But that didn't happen. So I think, you know, it's going to require more than that, but it really does require a paradigm shift. And I think, you know, in terms of even like everything, like the economy has to shift. We need to enter into some kind of gift economy,
yeah,
if we're going to get there.
Well, and educating ourselves starts with each one of us educating ourselves and trying to reconnect with that part of ourselves that can listen.
And if I could add one thing, I would just think it's finding places where you have to pay attention. I find when I'm in an urban space that I spend most of my time trying to filter out and ignore and block, and sort of what Lila was saying about that framing. If it's not inside your frame, I find in some environments you're constantly trying to exclude everything. And I think finding ways to pay attention, that deep listening, going back to a space where paying attention matters, becomes really fundamental. And I think that's the side of the work I do. I think that's sort of what Lila's been describing this whole discussion. And I think those are the ideas that Alex brings into this conversation, is just trying to be engaged. I think we've slipped into a world where disengagement and fragmented engagement is the driving paradigm. And, you know, hopping from, I think, what was your word, Alex? It was frenzy, right? And jumping from one performance to the next. And I think if you can slow that down and step back from that, and whether that's through your art making or just through lived life every moment, it has a lot of power for transformation.
Okay, that's great. That's like, we're actually pretty much at the end of our session, and that's a wonderful place to end. Slowing down. We've all gotten very good at blocking things out because there are so many demands inflicted on us, right? So I think that's a wonderful place to stop. Well, thank you to our panel. I encourage everyone who, we've gotten through the questions, but I encourage everyone who has further questions to try to connect with these panelists as you make your way through the conference. And this is, again, all from Ryerson University. The lunch table must be just fascinating. I just can't even imagine.
Oh, it has its moments. Thank you, Angela. You were really wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I lost you. Okay, well, we did. It was a great presentation anyway. Alexandra Ball, Steve Daniels, and Lila Pine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to following your work. Okay.
Well, Alan.